everybody. This is Eden Maybon of LightCycleAstrology.com. Today, I am getting into my part 4 for my 5 top astrology transits for 2023. In part 1, I went into one of my top 5 picks, which was the ingress of the planet Saturn into the sign of Pisces this year. Part 2 was the double new moon in Aries that trips out the rest of the lunation cycle for the year. Part 3 is a big one. That was Pluto entering Aquarius just for a short time during the year. Now, part 4 today, we're going to go into some Venus action, and this is the 2023 Venus retrograde. So Venus retrogrades this year by July 23rd in the sign of Leo. Venus retrograde periods occur every 18 months, and this pattern over time creates what is known as the Venus pentacle. I'm calling this the pentacle of desire, love, connection, creativity, beauty. And what I actually like to do is go ahead and show you guys an image of this. If you've never seen it, this is really cool. So you can see that all I did is type in Venus pentacle into Google here and for images. And this one is really neat because it shows you a color-coded path and coinciding with the year that this happened. So over time, Venus retrogrades through different signs, but it does so in a pentagram pattern. So it'll skip certain signs to make this 5-pointed star. To give you a sense of this image that you just saw, the last retrograde occurred in January 2022 in the sign of Capricorn. And then the one before that had bounced from on May 20th from Gemini. The one before that was in October 2018 in Scorpio. The one before that, March 2017 in Aries. And the one before that was 2015 in Leo. So we have 8 years between successive retrogrades that happen in the same sign. This whole pattern tends to retro shift over time, but that is beyond the scope of this video. I just want to give you a sense of the overall pattern here. Now let's go ahead and pull up the real-time clock so we can actually see the lead up to this Venus retrograde that is happening in July. So you can see I've got the real-time clock here set to about June 21st, the summer solstice moment. You've got the sun in Cancer. And now Venus has already entered by this time Leo. And the important thing here is you can see that Venus and Mars are getting pretty close. So what's going on is, just ignore the moon there for a second. What's going on is that Venus, being a faster moving planet, typically will be able to overtake Mars because Mars is a slightly slower moving planet. So usually what would happen without the Venus retrograde being near this moment is that Venus would simply just kind of make a conjunction to Mars and pass over it. And that would signify some Mars-Venus synodic, new seeding or cycle symbolically. But this time around, what's really interesting is that just as Venus is sort of almost catching up to Mars by June 21st, they're all only about 4, maybe 5 degrees apart here. By the time that Venus catches up to Mars and gets pretty close, within about 3.5 degrees, Venus actually starts slowing down to prepare for her station. And then she turns retrograde and Mars moves forward and out of sign, and Venus begins to roll backwards. So that is what is happening. So that is a big part of the symbolism for this year's Venus retrograde. So if we go forward by days, watch how Venus gets closer and closer. Right now, she's at 14, Leo. Now she's at 15. And right around the July the 2nd is actually when Venus gets closest to Mars. So that is when they become closest. And then what happens is, if you keep going forward in time, by days, Venus slows down each day a little bit. They do hang out for a prolonged period of time. It's about 10 days that they're actually right within this 3.5 degree orb of each other. So that is also significant. And eventually, though, as we move on in days here, Venus begins to slow down. And then by July 23rd, by July 17, we have the new moon in Cancer. Then Mars has already switched signs Venus is really close to stationing now. And after the new moon, this is really cool. Right as the sun enters Leo here on July 23rd, this is when you see Venus stationing. And after this, she will turn retrograde and head back towards the sun as the sun heads towards her. Now, what is significant about this is that the sun is now in its own domicile, co-present with Venus. So let's get into some of the significations for what all of this means. We can see that essentially Venus is chasing Mars, but before she can catch him, she loses steam. So, these two planets are the archetypal lovers. So Venus chasing Mars, you just get an image of one lover chasing another to start with. And the closest to each other is on July 2nd, exactly as they apply to perfect a square with Uranus. That's another thing that's really important. So whenever an aspect is formed between two planets, in ancient astrology, they called that like a testimony of seeing something testifying to a signification. So, for instance, the language that you could see with this is Uranus testifies to the fact that Venus is desiring excitement, seeking uncharacteristic or unusual attractions, attention, pleasure, sex. So these two planets are in aspect to each other, and Uranus is testifying. Uranus is saying there is an omen sign that what is happening right now, as per mirrored in the heavens and the relationships between the gods in the sky, is that there is something that Venus wants that is a little bit Uranian, right? So now Venus is also in Leo, so she feels very bright. She feels important, dramatic, beautiful. Leo is a place where Venus could be full of self-love, self-confidence. And what is she doing at this moment leading up to her station retrograde? Well, she is chasing passion. She's chasing Mars. She's chasing danger, conflict, actions, unions of war and peace. Here we go with some Venus-Mars significations. War and peace being unified, violence and sex, the art that cuts, right? We have Venus signifying art. We have Mars signifying cuts or lesions or some kind of war-like violence. So there's potentially something creative from Venus that is connected to something dangerous or severing from Mars. Art that cuts. So I think that's really interesting. She may sever relations with a partner in order to feel the excitement of being free, chasing the image of self-discovery, being in the sign of Leo. That's one way that this could precede the Venus retrograde moment. Venus could simply feel like she has to sever something in order to find new self-discovery. But alternatively, she could also have a breakthrough, that connection to Uranus, maybe in a relationship that heals or tries to make peace of an old wound, perhaps in a relationship. So this is something where that connection to Uranus could signify something like relations having kind of a breakthrough. And because of that connection to Mars, maybe there's a new birth that is trying to soothe that old wound, indicated by Mars being there. It is likely that she feels puffed up in a sense of self-gravitas or authority. That's because, she's in Leo, and in Leo, the sun's temple is a place where the light of desire or the light of knowledge, the light of ambition, the gravitas of center and God, it's really all consuming, and the light sort of encompasses everything that you see outwards. So there could be a little bit of that puffed up, vain Venus shadow side. We're going to get into that in a little bit here, but there could also be that. Okay, now by July 17th, the new moon in Cancer is in aspect to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So if you look at the chart, let's actually go back for a second and pull up the chart so you can see what I'm saying here. But we'll go back to the new moon. And look at this. The new moon is happening just in this last 5 degrees of Cancer and making a pretty little bit of a separating sextile to Uranus, but still within orb, and also an applying inferior trine to Neptune, and then, sort of walking into this opposition with Pluto. So you could, I suppose, you could sort of interpret all three of those by aspect and stuff. But I think the overall sense that I'm getting is that when you have this new seed that is forming, and that seed has visual aspectual connection to these outer planets that were all discovered, planets that are all beyond the visible realm of Saturn, you get a sense that there's something very otherworldly, right? Uranus is beyond the limitations of Saturn. Neptune is beyond the limitations of the living in some sense. And so is Pluto. Pluto brings us into the realm of the afterlife. So you get a sense that what is happening here is you have a moon, a new moon occurring in the sign of Cancer. And that is going to indicate that there is some new cycle beginning in a place that often wants us to return home, to return to mother or source or God, or family. There's some kind of return to something that is at the center of origin. And while that is taking place, having these connections to these very mystical outward planets, to me, just speaks in general to this being a time where, there is this very otherworldly quality that is pulling you in. So I've got, I think the language I used was beginning a new cycle colored by very otherworldly feelings, seeking a return to a vast and deep connection to source, mother, home, emotional comfort, and security. By July 19th, the sun begins opposing Pluto, intensifying the tension between work and home, family and the world, spiritual longing versus mundane duties, and comforts versus like austerity, etc. So again, you could sort of see this coming up a few days later, where now the sun is walking into this opposition to Pluto here. So the sun just at the last part. So this is pretty intense, right? Whenever the sun opposes Pluto, this is intense. So you're just pulling in some of these notions of the sun being the time of the summer solstice where there's a lot of light, and Pluto, a planet of Hades and the afterlife or the underworld, being in a sign that is associated with the, some of the darkest periods during the year seasonally. So you get the sense that there's this pull between light and dark. There's this tension, there's intensity coming from this oppositional aspect to Pluto. And then look what happens right after that. This is amazing. We have the sun ingressing into the sign of Leo, jumping ship here. And now, there we go. Now the sun has returned to its glorious home. And this happens right as Venus stations to turn retrograde. So how about that sequence of actions? And so by July 23rd, sun enters Leo in the midst of an intense wrestling with light and darkness. But ultimately, because we see the sun entering its own temple, we're going to look at dignity here and say that the sun is in this tension or battle with Pluto, a battle of light and dark somehow, of home and world or what have you. And the sun being transferred into its own domicile indicates that at some point the sun is able to pull victory from that opposition. And that's what I'm getting at. So there's an initial intense wrestling between those dark and light forces, but the light ultimately prevails, signified by the sun returning home. And this immediately begins calling Venus back to a sense of self-love. So here you are. The sun comes in and says, hey, Venus, I got your back. You are slowing down. Things are becoming a little bit reversed, right? The motion of Venus, she is not able to move forward with a sense of her own autonomy and willpower. By this point, she is being carried back into the the fated hands of the gods, right? Or the god head. She is being pulled back into that primary motion of the sky, which represents that she is losing autonomy. She is becoming weakened. She is having to do what fate is, there's something very fated, a turn in fortune or circumstance. And it's as if the sun is there to support her and give her resources in order to refind her sense of personal empowerment in terms of pleasure or what makes you feel happy, what makes you feel joy, all things that are like about the self and pleasureful. So, of course, this could be relating to relationships, sex, any number of Venus archetypal qualities. Now, one thing that's fun to do, though, is just to check out what were the ancient astrologers talking about if you read some of the ancient texts. So out of the Hellenistic Astrology book by Chris Brennan, there is a word, I hope I can pronounce some of these okay, hupopodizontis, ancient Greek, right? Which meant retracing their steps. So this is a term that they used in the ancient world, and that is indicating delays, right? From Paulus, he said that retrograde action signified more impotent, ineffectual, or insignificant. So you can get this sense that the power of the planet to signify its natural archetypes is being weakened. It's ineffectual. It's insignificant. To give you an example of this, let's say that I don't know. Let's say you try to have like a romantic evening. Okay, well, let's make it like Venus and Leo kind of thing. Let's say that you find a way to get some time to yourself and you're going to go do something that you really enjoy doing. This is signifying that the power for that to come about, the outcome when you try to do that, you may try to do it, but the outcome isn't going to be effective, ineffectual, insignificant, impotent, right? So Valen says that retrograde planets are weakened, restrained, hindered, giving only appearances and hopes. This is one of my favorite ones. Giving only appearances and hopes that are illusionary. Oh, sorry about that misspelling here, guys. Venus or Mercury retrograde has really been taking a toll on my spelling. But giving only appearances and hopes. So again, it's like, especially with Venus, you can imagine with a planet that has a connection to vanity, as such as Venus does in its more shadowy side. Venus can be vain, right? Can do things for the superficial aspect. So I think that is probably something that, as an ancient phrase or signification for a retrograde planet, really is going to play into this, giving only appearances and hopes. So you get the sense that although there is some support from the sun, and this could work out where anything in authority in your life, like a father figure or a boss at work or anybody that has authority that you recognize in your life, even could be like if you get pulled over by a policeman or something like that, there's some sense in which there is some support, but it's like you muddle through and there's some vain attempt to make something fair or just maybe, or a sense of trying to find, that Venusian aesthetic, that grace, that quality of action. And it either falls on deaf ears or people see through it and they see through the maybe superficial attempts or whatever, something along those lines. When a planet stations direct, it removes the hindrances and restores and leads to the stability of life. So that's essentially what happens after the retrograde cycle is over. The blocks or hindrances become removed, and Venus now has action to do things according to her own will and it works out. The outcomes are better. From the book Ancient Astrology by Demetra George, we have Paulus again saying, influences are useless, unfavorable for action, insignificant. Pretty much the same theme. But Dorotheus we have now here is difficulty and misfortune, pretty basic. And Ibn Shaul says disobedience, contradiction, diversity, or discord. I really like this one, but what he's getting at, what Demeter says that he's getting at is that Venus, in this erratic move that it makes in its orbit, it's going forward and then it does this loop. That erratic, all of a sudden loop is being equated by ancient astrologers to be a little bit rebellious. A rebellious quality seen by the planet's erratic movement as it loops retrograde. So there's kind of a disobedient, maybe a what do you get from that? Like potentially like cheating, right? You're no longer obedient to your relationship or to what somebody else is wanting you to do. Maybe you're trying to do things for yourself with Venus in Leo, and if it comes down to it, you might be disobedient, you might rebel, you might say, you know what, no, this is my time, I've got to do this. And I guess in the worst case scenario, we could see some people cheating on each other or something like that. Infidelity. Okay, retrograde planets speed up near the oppositional point, indicating pushing the envelope at that moment. So again, more of this sort of erratic, rebellious quality, where generally speaking, retrograde planets, besides this one portion of their orbit where they go through the conjunction with the sun, where they speed up, the rest of the time during retrograde, planets are said to move the slowest, more than at any other time in the whole cycle that they have around their orbit. So this indicates basically, you know, this sense that things are weak. The medieval astrologers said that it was like they had this word that's close to impede, but it's impedited, which meant to shackle or snare the feet, progress through obstacles, right? So there's some sense definitely in which retrograde Venus in Leo is going to try to do things for its own gratification, pleasure, attraction, beauty, art, creativity, and through some way or another, there are obstacles in it, and it's difficult, right? It's difficult to produce the outcomes that one would want. So now the last point here, though, is it's just sort of getting more into the shadow side of the light, meaning Venus in the temple of the light, the sun's temple here. You could see on the shadow side, again, some more of Venus's darker archetypes, vanity, blinding you with a all-consuming gravitas or self-love, seeking pleasure at the expense of others. So I think you get the point by now. There are some good things with this, but there are also some difficult things. So that is what to expect for the Venus retrograde. What is interesting is that out in the world, you could see this archetype playing out when it comes to movie stars, actresses, anything that sort of represents Venus as a famous and beautiful person, because we're combining Venus with the sun. And the sun often indicates people that are famous or very important. So you might see people in high positions of power that somehow have a aesthetic connection to art or beauty, modeling, actressing, things like that. You could see people in those places of power suffering a little bit of a fall from grace. That is something that we'll most likely definitely see just out there in the world, in the news or on social platforms or what have you. But in terms of how this could affect you personally, this is where you really want to plug this into your natal birth chart based on your rising sign. So if Leo is occupying your whole sign second house, then there could be some sense in which you try to invest or buy or spend money on things that make you feel better about who you are as a person. And those things could become difficult, or there could be some challenges or obstacles around those. that's a much different meaning than if it falls in your seventh house, where, it sounds like it's going to be more about healing some relationships or something like that. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Please let me know in the comments how this Venus retrograde seems to show up in your life. That's always really great to see those examples, how they played out. And I'm going to be back tomorrow with another video. It's going to be the last part of the series of the 5 biggest transits for 2023 that I'm seeing. And we're going to get into the eclipses that are happening in Scorpio, which is going to be phenomenal. So please check that out. Please leave a comment in the comment section below. Like, share, and subscribe. I'm trying to grow the channel in this new year. That's my new year goal. And I appreciate all the new subscribers, and take care, everybody. I'll be back real soon with another astrology video. Bye for now.